You'd think the worst part of baking was the heat, but no true misery starts long before the oven's light. I'm your bedtime historian, and this morning's alarm comes with a side of frostbite. Because in Victorian England, the bakery day didn't begin. It ambushed you, usually while it was still dark enough to doubt your own sanity. A hallway colder than outside, boots stiff with yesterday's slush, a uniform that crackles when you move, layered with crusted flour and regret. Boys, barely 15, lurch from their straw beds to stumble into the darkness, fingers already aching. A bell might ring, or a shout, or just the unmistakable scrape of your master's boots. Miss it, and you might lose your breakfast, or worse, earn a black mark that follows you for weeks. If this kind of oddly cozy suffering warms your insomnia-rattled brain, maybe hit like and subscribe. You'll get more of these half-frozen, flour-dusted nightmares every week, gentle ones, I promise. Ever watch bread rise while the rest of your city sleeps? Tell me your favorite midnight snack and the time on your clock right now wherever you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The real shift began around 3 a.m., just late enough to make you question your life choices, and just early enough that the world outside felt fictional. Street lamps flickered against fog. Chimneys exhaled their first breaths. Apprentices hauled flour sacks the size of toddlers through alleys slick with last night's frost. Why teenagers? Mostly because they were cheap bendable and too young to unionize. Families signed them over by contract, trading a slice of future stability for years of sweat. Some boys cried their first week. Others just didn't come back after lunch. But for the ones who stayed, the rhythm of early bakery life became as familiar as breath. Uniforms were more prison than profession stiff collars, itchy wool, and aprons that somehow always smelled of wet yeast. Cold was a constant enemy. Some tied hot bricks into their boots. Others wrapped their hands in ragged linen dipped in lard. The air was a cocktail of coal smoke sourdough starter and whatever rodents had been caught in the traps overnight. Some bakers were kind in a gruff, "Don't drop that," or "I'll drop you" sort of way. Others reveled in their tiny empires of discipline. A late apprentice might get walloped with a rolling pin, or assigned to fire duty a job so despised it became shorthand for failure. Being sent to mine the ash meant you'd messed up bad. Historians still argue whether Victorian bakers were artisans or just glorified laborers. On one hand, they created something essential, something daily. On the other, they worked in soot, were paid in scraps, and rarely earned public admiration. Their skill was invisible. Their hours were brutal, and their only consistent companion silence. Even the silence had layers, the thick kind that made the flour dust echo in your nose, the breathy kind before a loaf is shaped, and the unsettling kind that filled the room when a fire refused to catch and all you could do was wait and hope the master didn't notice the delay. Still in that quiet, strange little comforts bloomed. Apprentices whispered jokes through their scarves. Someone might hum a hymn softly like a lullaby against the cold. A shared glance when the butter actually arrived fresh. Moments that passed as quickly as they formed, but stayed lodged in memory like warm coals in ash. And outside, the sky stayed stubbornly dark. One rooster crowed late. Another never bothered. Because in a Victorian bakehouse, the only true signal of morning was you. The first hint of warmth doesn't come from the sun, it comes from the ovens. And in a Victorian bakery, those ovens never truly slept. They were always warm, always hungry, always one bad decision away from scorching everything, including you. By 3:30 a.m., the prep room starts to shift. Frosted breath still clouds the air, but now it mingles with smoke. The oven doors creak open like ancient mausoleum lids, releasing gusts of heat that make your cheeks sting and your eyes tear. Fire bricks glow faintly inside their edges, crusted with soot. Damp cloths hang over wooden paddles, ready to be tossed over dough, not for moisture, but to keep temperature even. If the cloths dry out too fast, you start again. Bakers use tricks passed down like sacred spells. How to gauge heat, not with thermometers, but with the back of your hand, or the sound a loaf made when it hissed on the stone. Some even claimed they could smell when the oven was right. Others used ash piles in the corners to catch and redistribute heat. The goal wasn't precision. It was intuition, sweat, and sheer nerve. You work fast because hesitation means heat loss. One apprentice fans the flames. Another slides trial loaves into a corner to test the hot spots. It's a kind of ballet, but with more burns. Everyone moves in practiced rhythm, though no one's talking much, not over the roar of fire and the hiss of wet cloth on hot brick. Here's where you meet the baker's tan, a lopsided sunburn that marked apprentices and masters alike. One side of your face, one arm, always more red than the other. It was a badge not of honor exactly, but of belonging. If your skin didn't sting, you probably hadn't been working hard enough. Some scholars suggest the tan was so common, it became an inside joke in the trade. Others claim it led to health concerns, later in life, particularly in bakers, who stood closest to the mouth of the oven. But surviving diaries mostly treat it like a nuisance, less dangerous than the blisters, more annoying than the soot in your tea. Every bakery had its tricks for managing heat. Some placed iron kettles filled with water near the oven's edge to create steam. Others swore by sticking raw potatoes in to judge how evenly the heat flowed. And then there were the superstitions throwing salt over the fire brick if the dough wasn't rising, or chalking crosses onto oven doors before the first bake. No one questioned it. When your livelihood depended on something as chaotic as temperature, you took comfort in rituals. The heat brought danger, yes, but it also brought a strange relief. After hours of biting cold, even the blistering air felt like a mercy. Apprentices lingered a little too long in front of the fire, even after their eyebrows started to singe. Sometimes, if the master wasn't watching, they'd warm their breakfast crust on the edge of the oven door. By 4:15 a.m., the room fogs with flour dust and vapor. Your back is slick. Your hands are dry. Your boots are softening from the heat rising through the floor. The fire crackles, and you lean close knowing this might be your last real warmth until nightfall. And yet, as the room fills with the first scent of baking bread, there's a moment of peace. The flames dance. The ash settles. For a heartbeat, the world feels like it's turning just for you. It lives in a jar, hisses like a cat, and smells like socks left in a cellar. Yeast, your fickle little companion. In a Victorian bakery, yeast wasn't just an ingredient. It was a moody, bubbling pet that needed constant coddling, bribing, and the occasional whispered apology. Victorian bakers often guarded their yeast starters like family heirlooms. Kept in crockery jars or earthen pots, these wild cultures were rarely replaced and never shared outside the shop. Some bakers even named theirs, jokingly, yes, but with the same nervous affection you might give a goat that kicks when ignored. If the starter died, the day was ruined. If it turned sour, so did your reputation. Most starters were a mix of flour water and airborne hope. They bubbled in corners of the kitchen, feeding on ambient warmth and flour dust. Every bakery had its own feeding ritual. Some added a pinch of sugar, others a dash of old beer. The goal was a thick, frothy blob that smelled slightly sweet, slightly sour, and completely alive. Too flat dead, too foamy overexcited. You had to know its moods like a nanny knew a colicky baby. And if your own starter failed, well, you borrowed or stole. Bakeries were surprisingly territorial about their yeast, which is why young apprentices were sometimes sent on quiet missions offering coin or crust in exchange for just a pinch. Borrowed yeast was tucked in kerchiefs, wrapped in damp cloth, and smuggled home like contraband. Some even claim rival shops sabotaged each other's cultures by sneaking in vinegar or salt. Historians remain divided on how long it took to train a good starter. Some accounts suggest it could be done in a few days. Others insist it took years of refinement, temperature control, and emotional manipulation. And while commercial yeast began appearing in the late Victorian era, most small shops clung to their wild cultures out of habit, pride, or superstition. There's a peculiar intimacy to working with something that breathes. You feed it. You talk to it, some bakers even sang. You watched for bubbles, sniffed for tang, and prayed it didn't throw a tantrum during a weather change. One diary from 1883 recounts an entire batch of loaves collapsing during a thunderstorm, blamed entirely on the yeast's mood. Quirky methods emerged to keep the cultures warm. Some bakers tucked the jars inside their coats, close to their chest, or nestled them near the bread oven's flue. One apprentice claimed his starter lived in his sock drawer. Others crafted makeshift yeast boxes, small wooden compartments, lined with wool, and set beside the stove. Of course, not all starters were equal. Some developed flavors that made loaves famous. Others turned sharp or sluggish. The sourness of a bread could mark its region, its age, even the character of its baker. Bakers in coastal towns swore their starters had a salty tang thanks to the sea air. Urban bakers blamed soot for the occasional bitterness. There's no scholarly consensus on how much of this was science versus storytelling. But if you ask an old baker, they'll tell you good yeast was like a marriage, full of strange smells, quiet resentment, and constant negotiation. And so, each morning, before the dough could rise, you had to wake the beast. Stir it gently. Feed it warmly. Then hope above all that it liked you today. There's a knock at the door. Not a customer. Not a friend. No, it's the inspector. And he's here to sniff your bread. Victorian bakeries operated under a strict and strange kind of law. Not criminal, not civil, call it crustal, because the price weight and even texture of your bread wasn't just up to you. It was governed by rules handed down by bakers' guilds, enforced by men nicknamed bread sniffers, and occasionally punished by public shame. Welcome to the world of flour-dusted politics. Guilds were powerful organizations in many towns and cities. Some acted like unions, protecting workers' rights and regulating hours. Others were more like mafias, with secret meetings, handshake deals, and a keen interest in what your flour weighed. Membership was coveted, but costly. To sell bread in a guild-protected district without joining risky. To be caught altering your flour ratio or underweighting your loaves, downright foolish. That's where the inspectors came in. These were not the white-gloved hygienists of modern food safety. They were often bakers themselves, older men with good noses and sharper eyes. Their primary job, check weights, look for illegal ingredients, and sniff for fraud. Literally, the term bread sniffer wasn't a joke, it was a badge of office. They'd lift a loaf, squeeze it, smell it, and sometimes even taste it. If it was too light, too airy, or smelled faintly of ash trouble. One popular scam was to fluff up dough using old chalk powder or alum, a bleaching agent that made bread whiter and thus more refined. Another trick involved reusing stale loaves by steaming them, reshaping, and rebaking them to fool the public. Guilds outlawed both practices, but enforcement varied. In some cities, inspectors made surprise visits. In others, they announced their rounds like minor royalty. What happened if you were caught? Punishments ranged from fines to losing your stall. In a few cases, bakers had to wear signs reading "cheated the public" or stand beside their defective loaves in the town square while townspeople jeered. It was a humiliation ritual, dressed up as justice. But it worked most of the time. Some scholars still argue how widespread these inspections actually were. Rural bakers seem to avoid the worst of it, especially those outside guild control. But urban shops, especially in London, reported frequent checks. Some even bribed inspectors with warm rolls or fresh butter to look the other way. The guilds also regulated pricing. Bread was one of the few foods that had a just price, meaning you couldn't just raise your rate because grain got expensive. If flour went up, your profits went down. If you raised your loaf cost, you might spark a bread riot, yes, a real one. History is littered with stories of communities revolting when bread became unaffordable. It wasn't just food, it was stability. So bakers learned to play the game. They adjusted water content. They shaped loaves smaller but heavier. Some hid tiny lead weights inside dough to fool the scales, though that usually ended in disaster when a customer broke a tooth. Others developed their own honesty marks, symbols cut into the crust to show their bread had passed inspection. But not everyone trusted the system. A few bakers worked only at night, selling loaves directly from their back doors to avoid taxes and oversight. They were known as moon bakers, romantic name, slightly criminal reality. So as you press dough into its mold, your eyes flick to the window. Is that a customer or a sniffer? You dust your apron, straighten the crust, and prepare your best innocent smile. Just another day in the bread bureaucracy. The flour didn't care what gender you were. It clung to everyone, equally sticking in eyebrows, creeping into sleeves, and settling like pale dust over ambition. But in Victorian bakehouses, equality stopped at the door. Women were there, yes, but not always seen. While the bakery floor was officially a man's domain, many shops relied heavily on female labor. Girls, sisters, wives, and widows worked the quieter corners, mixing packaging, delivering. They kneaded behind doors, wrapped loaves in brown paper, and balanced baskets on their heads like soft crusted crowns. The work was hot-heavy and often thankless. Victorian dress codes didn't help. Women in bakeries wore long skirts, high collars, and stiff aprons, often in spaces where the temperature could reach near boiling by mid-morning. The result, layers soaked through with sweat flour, turned to paste, and cheeks flushed not with health, but with heat stroke. Diaries from the time note women fainting during summer bakes, only to be revived with water and a firm back to it. Yet they showed up, every morning, some before dawn, alongside brothers or husbands. Others came later tasked with sorting orders or sweeping the perpetual dust that no broom ever conquered. In many families, a woman's wages made the difference between stale bread and fresh meat. And for widows, especially those who inherited shops after their husbands died, the bakery became both livelihood and legacy. Still, their names rarely appeared on shop signs. Male bakers signed the books, spoke to the inspectors stood at the counter. Women. They folded the paper, tied the string, and slipped out the back before anyone noticed. One recurring task for women was delivery, especially to middle-class households that expected their breakfast warm and on time. Girls as young as 10 carted loaves through narrow lanes, their baskets nearly as wide as they were tall. They dodged coal carts, slippery cobblestones, and the occasional roaming pig. And always, they were expected to smile. Social scorn was part of the uniform. Working women were seen as rough, especially those with soot on their sleeves and hair that smelled of yeast. Some customers wouldn't speak directly to them, choosing instead to address notes to the man of the shop, even when they knew it was the baker's wife running the whole show. One journal entry from 1871 tells of a woman who burned both arms, removing loaves too quickly. The blisters burst, but she kept wrapping bread, only pausing to dab flour on the wounds, which acted as a kind of makeshift bandage. Another entry describes a young girl scolded not for being late, but for arriving with smudged shoes. Presentation apparently mattered more than pain. Historians continue to debate whether women's contributions to Victorian baking were actively hidden or simply never documented. Surviving records skew male partly due to who could sign contracts and partly because the women were too busy to write anything down. But oral histories tell another story of mothers who ran night bakes, daughters who trained faster than sons and wives who quietly kept the ovens going during illness, war, or scandal. And yet, they left few marks. No statues, no recipes with their names. Just fingerprints in dough and the scent of bread carried through early morning fog. So next time you see an old bakery painting, look for the shadow at the edge. The woman smoothing parchment. The girl balancing a tray. The flour ghost, always working, always fading just out of the frame. You arrive before dawn and leave long after the last crust has cooled. You sleep near sacks of flour. You eat standing up. You are the baker's apprentice, and your life, as they say, is no piece of cake. Victorian apprenticeships weren't part-time jobs or internships. They were full immersion multi-year marathons of grit obedience and blistered fingers. Most apprentices were boys, typically aged 12 to 16, handed over by parents in exchange for housing meals and the vague promise of a future trade. But that housing often meant a cot in the storeroom and meals scraped from leftover dough. The first weeks were the worst. You were the outsider, the green loaf. Expect pranks, flour dumped in your boots, dough hidden under your pillow, or the classic salt in the sugar switch during prep. And beatings officially frowned upon, unofficially common. Some masters used paddles. Others preferred sarcasm sharp enough to peel potatoes. Either way, it was clear earn your place or get out. But why did so many stay? Because over time, the flour dust begins to feel like a second skin. You learn the rhythm of the oven's breath, the sound a well-kneaded lump makes when it slaps the bench, the soft thud of a finished loaf cooling on wood. And you get perks, two tiny strange ones. The first crust of the morning, still warm, an extra heel from the rye batch, or best of all, the ceremonial first bread. Ah, yes, the ritual. When an apprentice finally earned the master's trust, he'd be allowed to bake a loaf entirely on his own. No help, no advice. The loaf might turn out lumpy or undercooked, but it was his. Often it was scored with his initials, or a tiny symbol, half pride, half proof. Some apprentices kept their first loaf wrapped in cloth until it turned to stone. Others ate it immediately, grinning through the ash. The bread badge, as some called it, wasn't official. No certificate, no handshake. Just a nod from the master, and maybe, just maybe, a second helping of stew that night. There were darker sides, too. Apprentices were often expected to do the dirtiest work, cleaning out soot from oven chimneys, fetching water from distant pumps, and dealing with rats in the storeroom. Injuries were common, so were burned splinters, and the occasional bout of flour lung, a hacking cough that came from too many hours breathing in airborne wheat. Living arrangements were cramped. You might share a straw mattress with two other boys, heads and feet alternating. Privacy none. Respect earned slowly. But what you did gain was a sort of brotherhood. You learned to whisper jokes over the clatter of trays, to share bruises like war stories, and to laugh loud and freely when a senior baker tripped over a mop bucket. Some researchers suggest apprenticeships were less about teaching and more about testing. If you could survive 3 years in a bakehouse, you could survive anything. Others argue the system was exploitative, benefiting the shop more than the boy. But in the absence of modern schooling or career paths, this was what passed for opportunity. Not all apprentices became bakers. Some quit. Some moved on to other trades. But the ones who stayed, they wore their scars like medals. They spoke in yeast metaphors. And they remembered always the taste of that first bread burnt edges and all. So next time you hold a warm loaf, think of the teenager who once shaped it with shaking hands, gritted teeth, and hope kneaded into every fold. There's something oddly suspicious about generosity when it's baked into the rules. Take the baker's dozen, for instance. 13 loaves instead of 12. Sounds like a kindness, right? A quaint little bonus. But in Victorian bakehouses, that extra roll wasn't about goodwill, it was about fear. To understand the baker's dozen, you first need to understand the punishments. In many parts of England, strict laws governed the weight and price of bread. Sell a short loaf, and you could face hefty fines or worse public shaming. Some bakers even risked jail time for repeated offenses. And because flour quality varied, oven heat was fickle, and scales were often dodgy, it became all too easy to underdeliver by accident. So bakers developed a workaround: add one extra. If a customer ordered 12 loaves, they'd get 13. That 13th wasn't a gift, it was insurance. A buffer against the inspector's scale, a peace offering to the angry housewife who claimed her batch was too light. Give a little more than asked, and you might avoid trouble altogether. Some say the practice dates back to the 13th century, when King Henry III cracked down on dishonest bakers. But Victorian records show it still persisted hundreds of years later, especially in small shops that couldn't afford legal tangles. It became tradition so ingrained that customers expected it. A dozen meant 13, and anyone who gave just 12 looked stingy or suspicious. Apprentices called it the ghost loaf. You didn't always see it in the shop's tally, but it was there on the tray, in the delivery basket, quietly completing the count. Some shops went further, offering a baker's dozen plus one during holidays to thank loyal customers. But don't be fooled, it was still business strategy, not sentiment. There's no scholarly consensus on the origin of the term. Some claim it arose purely from fear of fines. Others argue it was a sign of customer loyalty, a silent handshake between baker and buyer. Still others suggest it was about balance. 13 loaves better filled a tray than 12, making stacking easier and less prone to tipping. But one thing's clear, the 13th loaf had power. Superstitious bakers treated it with caution. A few refused to place it directly on the stack, instead wrapping it separately or tucking it into the corner. One diary from 1869 even mentions a baker who always shaped the extra roll into an odd knot so it wouldn't confuse the spirits. Whether he meant ghosts or inspectors, no one's quite sure. Customers had their own tricks. Some insisted on choosing their own 13th loaf, believing it brought luck if it was warmest. Others gave it to the youngest child, or saved it for the household servant as a small act of pecking order kindness. In wealthier homes, the extra roll was fed to the dog, or more often forgotten in the pantry until it went stale. And for apprentices, the 13th roll was often their unofficial breakfast. If no customer claimed it and the master wasn't watching, it became fair game. Torn apart, quickly dipped in jam if available, or just eaten plain over a trash bin while no one was looking. So next time someone offers you a baker's dozen, don't just smile at the extra. Remember the nerves that created it, the rules that demanded it, and the centuries of flour-dusted fear baked into that soft, unsuspecting roll. The fire must never go out. That's the first rule whispered to every new apprentice. But what happens when there's no clean fuel left to burn? When coal deliveries are late and wood is too wet or too expensive? Welcome to the charcoal dilemma, where the heat kept coming even when it shouldn't. In Victorian bakeries, fire was life. It dried the dough, warmed the workspace, and kept the yeast bubbling along. But fuel was fickle, and not all of it was safe. When clean wood or high-grade coal ran out, bakers resorted to whatever they could scrounge: discarded furniture, splintered crates, even the odd fence post. In desperate times, they burned treated lumber coated in chemicals, paint, or varnish. It worked, but the consequences lingered in every puff of smoke. Some days the soot turned green. Other days, the air had a tangy bite like burning hair. Bakers knew the risks. Poisoned fumes could ruin a whole batch of bread, or worse, make people sick. Still heat was non-negotiable. No fire meant no crust. No crust meant no customers. So the ovens roared on, fed with whatever the day allowed. One infamous case from 1875 tells of a bakery in Manchester that used railway ties steeped in creosote to fire its ovens. The loaves came out dark, bitter, and oddly shiny. Customers complained of headaches. The shop was fined but not shut down. The next week, it happened again. Coal was just too expensive. Bakers had tricks for hiding the damage. Strong herbs could mask smoky undertones. Overbaking crusts gave the illusion of deliberate darkness. Some shops added extra salt, arguing the bread was a rustic variety. But customers noticed. They began checking the bottoms of loaves for smoke marks, blackened spots, or ash-blistered rings that betrayed the use of bad fuel. The presence of a smoke mark didn't just affect taste, it affected reputation. Word spread fast. One bad batch, and your regulars might vanish to the shop 2 streets over. A loaf with a heavy smoke mark might be discounted or fed to animals, or if things were tight, sliced thin and passed off as yesterday's stock. Some bakers tried to mitigate the risk with makeshift ventilation. Chimneys were swept with damp brushes. Sacks of flour were draped over vents to catch soot. One diary from a Liverpool bakehouse describes hanging wet linens from the ceiling to trap rising smoke, turning the room into a hot, damp cave of clinging cloth and wheezing boys. There's debate among historians about how dangerous these fumes really were. Some argue the levels of toxicity were low and unlikely to cause lasting harm. Others point to reports of chronic coughs, nausea, and fainting spells among both workers and customers. But records are sparse, and many symptoms were chalked up to overwork or weak constitution. One overlooked detail is how the smell clung. Bakers reeked of smoke, not the pleasant campfire kind, but the bitter tang of half-burned varnish and damp coal. It got into their aprons, their hair, their teeth. Some joked they were half human, half chimney. Others stopped noticing entirely. Even bread deliveries carried the scent. Housewives sniffed their loaves before buying. Servants were told to check for sting. And apprentices, once dismissed with a whack for complaining, learned to keep quiet and keep stoking. Because no matter what the oven had to stay hot, even if it meant breathing in the past lives of broken chairs, peeling window frames, and old bedposts, the dough is breathing. Not in the literal sense, but close. You press your fingers into its surface, and it springs back slowly, like a sleepy cat stretching after a nap. Welcome to the quietest part of the bakehouse rhythm rising. Unlike the frantic heat of the ovens or the clatter of flour sacks, the rising stage demands stillness. Timing intuition, and touch no gadgets, no thermometers, just generations of guesswork passed hand to calloused hand. In a Victorian bakery, this was the moment when experience mattered more than anything else. The dough's temperature had to be just right. Too cold, and it sulked. Too hot, and it fermented too fast, losing shape. And Victorian kitchens were drafty places. Stone walls, broken window panes, chimneys that pulled heat away instead of trapping it. So bakers became inventors of warmth. Some wrapped dough bowls in wool or flannel. Others placed them near the oven's flue or nestled them under benches. But the strangest method, carrying the dough inside your coat close to your chest like a flowery secret. One apprentice in 1884 wrote of keeping rolls beneath me shirt for half the morning, terrified the master would notice the smell of yeast in his armpits. There were whispered superstitions, too. Don't whistle while the dough is rising, it scares the yeast. Don't slam the door. Don't look at it too long. One baker even claimed that speaking kindly to the dough helped it rise better, like coaxing a skittish animal. Whether true or not, these rituals added a touch of magic to the otherwise mechanical labor. And so bakers waited. They watched the air bubble beneath the surface. They poked gently, then waited again. It was a rare slice of calm in a job defined by heat sweat and aching feet. But the calm didn't mean comfort. The room stayed cold around the dough, and apprentices were warned never to stand too close lest their body heat ruin the balance. So you'd sit just out of reach, sipping lukewarm tea, pretending not to watch the bowl, while secretly hoping it would rise just a bit faster this time. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these folk methods. Some argue the coat trick had little impact on fermentation and more on the psyche of cold-bored boys. Others believe the body warmth and movement actually helped maintain a gentle, consistent temperature. Either way, the practice endured, passed on not in books, but in casual shrugs and muttered warnings. The rising time varied anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on flour-type water content and the mood of the yeast. Too fast, and the loaf would collapse in the oven. Too slow, and the morning rush would come and go with no bread to sell. And so, in that suspended stretch of waiting time, played tricks. The sound of other bakers shuffling about grew louder. The fire popped. The dust floated lazily in sunbeams that had finally begun to sneak through high, grimy windows. Outside, a milk cart rattled past. One apprentice might sneak a bite of buttered crust, while another cleaned a soot-smudged tray. But someone kept half an eye on the dough ready to shout if it began to slouch or rise too fast. Because once it peaked, the next race began. But for now, you watch. You breathe slow, and you wait for the moment when the dough swells with silent pride and says ever so softly, "I'm ready." White bread was a status symbol. Brown was a burden. And every loaf that passed through a Victorian bakehouse carried more than crust, it carried class. To understand Victorian bread is to understand its color. The paler the loaf, the wealthier the buyer. White flour was finely sifted, polished, and stripped of much of its original grain. It took longer to produce and cost more to buy. It also looked cleaner, an illusion that fed a cultural preference for refined foods. Brown bread, with its flecks and specks, was often seen as coarse, rural, or simply poor. So bakers adapted. They played with presentation, using crust-color loaf shape and even scent to cater to different clientele. A narrow, tall loaf with a golden shell might be placed in the shop window to attract upper-class eyes. A squat, round loaf, cheaper to make and more filling, was sold in the back to servants and laborers. But the pressure to deliver white bread didn't always match the flour supply. Good quality white flour was expensive. When profits thinned, some bakers reached for additives. Chalk, plaster dust, even alum. These were sometimes mixed into flour to mimic that prized pale shade. It was risky and illegal, but it fooled the eye. One 1850s investigation revealed a popular London bakery adding whitening powder to their dough. The loaves looked stunning bright as linen, but customers soon fell ill. Their symptoms: nausea, headaches, and in one case, mouth ulcers. The bakery shut down, but rumors of similar practices lingered. There's no scholarly agreement on how widespread flour adulteration really was. Some historians believe it was relatively rare and overblown by moralist pamphlets. Others argue it was endemic, especially in urban centers where demand for cheap white bread outpaced honest supply. Customers weren't powerless. Some brought their own scales. Others demanded to see flour before purchase. And still, class anxiety over color remained. Servants often reported being scolded for bringing home loaves too brown, even if the weight and quality were higher. Bread, like fashion, was about appearances. Even crust played a role. A darker crust could signal overbaking or poor flour. A perfect golden hue uniform and clean meant precision and expense. Wealthy buyers would sniff loaves for any hint of smoke, examine edges for cracks, and even tap the bottom for that satisfying hollow sound. It was less a purchase, more a performance. Loaf shape was coded too. Long, slender loaves were easier to slice for delicate tea sandwiches. Rounder loaves were cut into wedges and slathered with dripping suitable for factory lunches, not drawing room teas. Some bakers began shaping bread to match their clients' tidy rectangles, for the middle-class rustic rounds, for market folk fancy plats for special occasions. Bakers had to juggle both aesthetics and economics. They created white show loaves for the window, sometimes hollow inside, and cheaper, denser bread for bulk orders. The latter might be sold as country loaves, appealing to nostalgia while keeping costs low. But the truth was plain. If you were buying bread with visible brand, society likely saw you as second tier. Still, not everyone played along. Reformers began advocating for whole grain loaves, citing nutrition and tradition. Some shops proudly sold brown bread as honest bread, but it was a hard sell. In a world obsessed with refinement, even the humble loaf became a stage for social theater. So the next time you see a simple loaf of bread, remember, in Victorian England, it wasn't just food. It was status sculpted in flour, and no crust was ever truly neutral. Bread wasn't always bought. Sometimes it arrived balanced on heads, strapped to backs, cradled in baskets. But Victorian bread deliveries weren't just charming street scenes. They were daily marathons of grit risk and very strategic footwork. Delivery boys, and occasionally girls, formed the nervous system of the Victorian bakehouse. While the bakers molded and fired their loaves, these young runners dodged soot carts, puddles, and pickpockets to bring warm bread to customers before breakfast cooled. Most began their rounds before the fog lifted, carrying handwritten slips or memorized routes and a warning, "Don't lose a loaf." Some deliveries were made on foot, with wide wicker baskets balanced precariously on shoulders or heads. Others used hand carts, or if the shop was lucky, rusty bicycles with wobbling front racks. The baskets were often too large for the children who carried them, causing them to tilt slightly with every step, sending rolls rolling and rye bouncing, if not expertly packed. The biggest enemy, the streets. Cobblestones jostled every step. Slippery mud from horse-drawn wagons turned alleys into obstacle courses. And in winter, ice turned even flat roads into treacherous runways. Delivery boys quickly learned to map every pothole, every shortcut, every fence low enough to jump if a dog gave chase. Some routes were calm and predictable, straightforward paths through middle-class neighborhoods, where customers waited at the door and tipped with coppers or crusts. But others, known as bread traps, they twisted through rougher districts where deliveries went missing, and so did delivery boys. A warm loaf, after all, was easy to steal and easier to resell. One boy in Sheffield reported losing 3 loaves in a single week to fast-handed urchins. Another carried a stick, not for balance, but for defense. There's little agreement among historians on how organized these routes were. Some bakeries employed dedicated delivery kids with assigned regions and strict check-ins. Others sent whoever was free and small enough to squeeze through back gates. Records are inconsistent, but oral histories paint a picture of young workers who were half courier, half acrobat, and full-time exhausted. Speed mattered. Victorian customers liked their bread warm, and woe to the boy who arrived late. It wasn't uncommon for households to refuse a cooled loaf or demand a discount. Some customers even touched loaves to their cheeks to test for heat, sending runners scrambling back to the shop for replacements if the crust was half dead. To cope, some boys got creative. One trick involved wrapping loaves in still warm oven rags to fake freshness. Another, delivering early to the kindest customer and circling back later to the stricter ones, buying time for the bread to seem more recent. It was a game of temperature and timing, and it took nerves. Clothing offered little protection. Most delivery kids wore threadbare jackets and caps boots with holes and aprons that once had color. Their fingers froze on frosty mornings and burned when the crusts inside their baskets were too hot. And when rain came, everything notes bread, dignity got soggy. Yet despite it all, some kids loved the work. It gave them freedom coins in their pocket and an excuse to race through the waking city like ghosts with purpose. And at the end of a long morning, they often returned to the bakery with one roll left, sometimes a reject, sometimes a tip, and sat on flour sacks, eating quietly, steam rising from their fingers. So if you ever wonder how a fresh loaf made it from oven to doorstep, picture this: a breathless child with wild hair and muddy boots running full tilt through soot and sunrise just to make sure breakfast made it home. The day may end, but the ovens do not sleep. Long after the city quiets and shutters its shops, The night shift in a Victorian bakery begins quietly, eerily, and with a strange mix of comfort and dread. For those who worked it, the dark hours offered both solitude and strangeness. Not all bakehouses operated at night, but the ones that did usually in larger cities relied on overnight labor to get ahead of the morning rush. Bread takes time to rise, to proof, to bake, to cool. By the time most people stretched their arms under warm duvets, the night bakers were already dusting benches and stoking embers with half-lidded eyes. And with the night came oddities. Rats for one. The quiet made them bold. Scratch, scratch from behind sacks, tiny paws clicking across floorboards. Some bakehouses kept cats for this very reason, long, lean creatures that prowled like sentries. Others used traps, or just accepted that a certain percentage of flour was negotiable. But even seasoned bakers admitted the rats felt different at night. Smarter, hungrier, braver. Then came the ghost stories. Every night baker knew at least one. A pale figure glimpsed near the door, a bowl moving on its own, an oven that creaked after it was extinguished. Some were obvious jokes, tales meant to scare apprentices into dropping dough, but others were told with a strange sincerity. One baker swore the spirit of a dead apprentice haunted their storeroom, knocking once, when a loaf was ready twice, when it would burn. Another claimed a former master still wandered the oven room, checking trays that hadn't been filled in years. Scholars tend to dismiss these as stress-borne hallucinations. After all, sleep deprivation, flickering lamplight, and a room full of warm smells can do odd things to the mind. But that hasn't stopped generations of bakers from watching corners with wary eyes and hanging small iron charms near the oven door. Still, for many, the night shift had its charms. The world slowed down. There were no inspectors, no shouting customers, no bustling deliveries. Just the hiss of rising dough, the crackle of coals, and the occasional soft whistle from a baker thinking of home. Conversations grew quieter, closer. Bakers swapped stories over shared mugs of chicory or weak tea. They played cards between proofs. They leaned against ovens, soaking in the heat like cats on a hearth. There was a rhythm to it. Mix, rest, knead, wait, bake, cool, repeat. A pulse that didn't rely on clocks but on feel. The dough told you when it was ready, not the hour. And in that rhythm, a kind of peace emerged, one found only in repetition and firelight. Yet the peace was fragile. If a batch collapsed, there was no one to help. If the fire died, reigniting it took time. And if your mind wandered too long, if you stared too deep into the shadows, you might find yourself remembering the stories. The girl who vanished on her third shift. The loaf that bore a mark no one remembered scoring. The apron tied in a knot only the dead baker used. Whether these tales were real or just flower-swept fantasy, they clung to the bakehouse like yeast to wood. Night baking was less lonely than it was liminal, half in this world, half in another. And when morning finally arrived, you'd blink at the sunlight like a mole shielding your eyes. The city would stir, unaware of what had risen while they slept. And you powdered in flour, and ghosts would step outside, just another shadow fading into day. The sugar sat under lock and key. Eggs were counted like coins, and pastries, oh pastries, were coddled like rare jewels. In a Victorian bakery, sweetness wasn't just flavor. It was economy, extravagance, and often envy on a plate. Unlike bread, which filled bellies and soothed class tensions, pastries were seen as indulgent luxuries, rare treats that spoke of parties, parlor visits, and paydays. Victorian pastry work required precision time and expensive ingredients, fine flour, fresh butterfruit, preserves, and of course sugar. But sugar wasn't a given. Its price fluctuated wildly, and bakers often rationed it more carefully than coal. Because of this, pastry counters were often glass-cased tiny crystal prisons displaying lemon tarts, jam puffs, and cream buns like museum artifacts. The phrase window bait emerged to describe these gleaming confections placed just behind spotless panes to lure passers-by. Some shops never intended to sell them. They were marketing edible temptation, and the bait worked. Inside the bakery, things were less polished. Making pastry was labor-intensive fiddly and fraught with risk. Dough tore, fillings leaked, sugar caramelized too quickly in the heat of the always-on oven. And if you messed up, the results couldn't be salvaged like a rustic loaf. A collapsed tart was a loss sometimes of money, sometimes of reputation. To reduce waste, many shops adopted the strategy of day-old puff. Slightly stale, but still respectable, these pastries were sold at a discount to servants or frugal customers who knew to ask at the back door. Some bakeries even developed special recipes meant to age well, denser crusts, dried fruit, less cream to extend shelf life without raising suspicion. Apprentices rarely touched the pastry counter. That was the realm of senior bakers, or in some cases women, especially in family-run shops, where the wife or eldest daughter had a flair for decoration. Icing was applied with the delicacy of embroidery. Currants were spaced like buttons. Glazes had to shine, not drip. A single smudge could ruin an entire tray. Pricing was another balancing act. Charge too much, and only the elite would buy. Charge too little, and customers assumed the pastry was subpar. So bakers developed subtle pricing tiers. The simplest sugar biscuit might be a penny, a custard tart 3. But an almond cream finger, wrapped in paper lace, boxed with a ribbon, that could fetch sixpence and spark arguments if the shape sagged. Some historians still debate who could truly afford Victorian pastries. While the middle class bought them for tea parties or Sunday treats, working-class families rarely splurged, except perhaps at holidays. For many children, a sugared bun was a birthday memory. For adults, a cream puff meant celebration, or in quieter moments, a secret indulgence. To maintain illusion, some bakers produced dummy sweets, hollow shells, or plaster models dusted with real sugar used only for display. A trick of light, a lie of luxury. These decoys sat safely behind glass, while the real pastries, less perfect, but perfectly edible, remained in the back. And yet, when customers did splurge, the joy was real. A tart eaten in the street, a biscuit shared on a factory break, a pie brought home placed on the mantel like a trophy. For a moment, even the humblest buyer felt like royalty. So next time you see a pastry too pretty to touch, remember the cost, the sugar guarded like treasure, the flour measured like gold, and the baker behind the counter squinting at crusts, chasing profit, and hoping the day-old puff wouldn't be the only thing that sold. Burns were expected. Blisters were badges. And bandages. Well, those often came pre-dusted with flour. In the steamy, soot-streaked chaos of a Victorian bakehouse, safety was never part of the recipe. There were no regulations, no protective gloves, no emergency eye wash stations, no health inspectors handing out smiley face stickers. You worked with fire iron and boiling water, all in close quarters, surrounded by flammable fabrics and hot surfaces that rarely cooled. Injuries were constant companions, the most common burns. Ovens were built like brick fortresses, low to the ground, deep and fiercely hot. Reaching inside them required long wooden paddles, but even those couldn't always save your forearms from stray contact. Apprentices bore the worst of it, arms marked with red stripes, wrists mottled with heat blisters. They learned quickly to move fast and not flinch. Bandaging was an art form, though not necessarily a hygienic one. A scrap of linen, a dab of lard, maybe some cold tea leaves if you were lucky. Some soaked burned skin in beer, believing it cooled faster and took the sting. Others wrapped their wounds in cabbage leaves, or oddly enough baked potato skins. If it stuck, it worked. If it didn't, you kept going anyway. One trick involved coating blisters with flour. Yes, flour. The thinking was that it kept the skin dry and the bandage in place. It also helped the baker blend back into the environment, white dust on white wrappings barely noticed. Diaries mention bakers with arms wrapped like mummies, still hauling trays, grunting softly with each movement. But burns weren't the only hazard. Sharp blades sliced dough, and sometimes fingers. Heavy flour sacks strained backs and tore shoulders. Soot from the oven stung eyes and lungs. One apprentice recounted black mucus after just 3 weeks on the job. The term baker's lung appeared in whispers, likely a blend of flour inhalation and coal dust damage, though no doctor dared name it. And yet pride grew from pain. Bakers told stories through their scars. A jagged line on the thumb meant you'd been rushing the rye. A thick welt on the forearm meant you'd worked double shifts through Christmas. Apprentices compared injuries like medals. Some even refused bandages altogether, letting wounds dry out in the heat of the oven room. One baker in Leeds, known only as Clary, claimed to have never worn an apron in 20 years, said it dulled his reflexes. His arms looked like tree bark. Another in Bristol tied a kerchief over his most recent burn and told customers it was a badge of the bread tribe. Romantic, maybe. Sensible, absolutely not. There's disagreement among scholars about whether this culture of endurance was born from necessity or pride. Some argue it was poverty, no time to rest, no backup staff. Others believe it became a sort of stoic code, a way to claim dignity in a job others saw as dirty or dull. Either way, it meant pain was expected, managed, and never spoken of too loudly. There were, of course, exceptions. A kind master might allow a day off. A wealthy bakery might afford proper salves. But most simply pressed on burned hands hidden behind loaves, pain softened by repetition and habit. And at the end of the day, as you wiped sweat from a face streaked with soot and steam, you might glance down at your bandaged wrist, flecked with flour, and think quietly that the bread wasn't the only thing hardened by the fire. Every loaf had a story. Not that anyone asked, but if you followed it from start to finish, from flour sack to breakfast table, you'd find a journey marked by heat fatigue, silence, and sometimes secrets. It began with a bang, or rather a groan, wooden wheels creaking under sacks of flour dragged in before dawn by boys too small for the load. The flour was sifted, mixed, salted, shaped, and coaxed to rise with breathy prayers. It passed through hands, both burned and numb, through air, both chilly and stifling. And always, it moved forward. Forward toward fire. Inside the oven, it changed. The dough swelled, split, cracked, and crusted. Bakers watched it, like hawks squinting through heat haze, fingers twitching near paddles, waiting for the precise moment between golden and gone. Too early, and it sank. Too late, and it darkened beyond saving. Then came the cool down. Freshly baked loaves were arranged on wooden slats, spaced like soldiers. The scent filled the room, yeasty warm edged with smoke. Apprentices dared not touch until they cooled, though everyone stole a glance, a sniff, sometimes a pinch. Because this was the moment of truth, the birth of the loaf. But even then, the journey wasn't done. The loaves had to be sorted by type weight destination. The chalkboard listed names. Some went to homes with lace curtains and silver toast racks. Others to basements, factories, or street carts. Each loaf slotted into the day like a cog in the city's clockwork. And in this flurry of crust and string, one final tradition remained the mark. Some bakers pressed symbols into their bread, not letters, but loop stars or curious slashes known only to them. These weren't just decoration. They were identifiers, brandings of ownership. A way to say, this came from our hands. We stood in the heat. We made this. There's some debate over the purpose of these markings. Practical. Perhaps they helped identify which batch came from which oven or which apprentice shaped what. But others suggest superstition played a part. A cross to ward off spoilage. A loop to bring luck. Or maybe it was just pride burned gently into the crust. One baker in Norfolk was known for placing a single currant in the bottom of his favorite loaves, hidden never mentioned. If a customer bit into it, he'd smile and say, "You got the lucky one." Did it mean anything? Who knows? But the gesture lingered like a warm echo. Once marked, wrapped, and packed, the loaves moved again. Delivery boys whisked them off into the fog. By noon, most would be sliced, buttered, devoured. By night, crumbs would gather on kitchen tables fed to birds or swept to corners. And still no one really thought about the journey. No one saw the blistered palms, the dough that wouldn't rise the moment the fire nearly died. They just tasted softness, warmth, and maybe a hint of smoke. The crust held the rest. But if you held one of those loaves a moment longer, tilted it toward the light, turned it in your hands, you might find a mark. A slash too deliberate, a swirl too careful to be random. That's where the story lives. Not in ink, not in books, in the crust. So when your fingers trace the ridge of that strange shape and your teeth break through that golden shell, you're not just eating bread, you're finishing a journey. And just as that crust bore the silent stamp of its makers, so too did another world, hidden not in bakeries, but beneath polished floors. Down there, where heat ruled and flour still clung to sleeves, another kind of story rose. You descend the narrow stairs, each one groaning softly under your weight. The scent changes the moment you pass the threshold, no longer floral perfume and polished wood, but scorched drippings, flour dust, and iron. Welcome to the kitchen below stairs. This isn't the gleaming, open-plan heart of a home you might know today. No marble countertops or cheerful chatter. Instead, you're met by low ceilings, flickering gas lamps, and a heat that clings like an apron worn too long. The kitchen was the pulse of a Victorian household, especially in the upper middle and upper classes. Situated below ground level, these spaces were designed to be out of sight and out of mind for the family upstairs. Yet paradoxically, they were more vital than almost any other room in the house. Here, entire menus were executed with precision and hierarchies enforced with a ladle and a raised eyebrow. The head cook reigned supreme, but their power was subtly political. Some scholars suggest that in large estates the cook wielded more sway over the household's reputation than the master himself. After all, social standing could rise or fall with the meringue. You spot the main attraction, a coal-burning range dominating the wall like a temple to fire. Every dish began here, its success dependent on airflow draft and timing. Beside it, a towering stack of pots glimmers with residual grease. Copper and cast iron blackened by use and still warm. The scullery maid darts past eyes down, carrying a basket of spoons too hot to hold. In this hierarchy, even utensils had seniority: wooden spoons for mixing, slotted ones for draining, and silver for the final flourish. Despite the clatter and chaos, the kitchen ran with uncanny efficiency. Recipes, if written at all, were terse and coded instructions for those already in the know. Orders were passed with clipped words and quicker looks. Some historians believe cooks intentionally left their notes vague, both to safeguard their skills and to ensure no one could replicate them outside the kitchen. It wasn't just food being prepared, it was legacy. The kitchen had its own strange rhythms, like a backstage performance where timing was everything. Meals were synchronized with bell signals from above, and when the bell rang, a current of anxiety passed through every apron in the room. You'd never guess that such anxiety once settled over a pot of boiled eggs or a roast goose, but in these walls, dinner wasn't just nourishment, it was theater. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these kitchens empowered their workers through routine or stifled them under it. Diaries from cooks and maids suggest both pride in a perfectly executed dish and exhaustion that never quite lifted. Still, you linger at the edge of the range, warmth brushing your shins. A whispered joke passes between two kitchen maids, inaudible, but followed by the rarest thing in this room, a laugh. Steam curls from the stovetop like a ghost rehearsing its lines. Somewhere, a spoon clinks softly against iron. You shift your gaze to the coal-burning stove, the stage on which Victorian meals rose or fell. This was no modern oven with predictable dials and beeping timers. Here, the heat was alive, temperamental, and utterly unforgiving. Welcome to the coal stove ballet, where every meal danced on a knife edge between glory and soot. In these kitchens, managing heat wasn't just a skill, it was an art form passed down like folklore. The coal range required constant tending. Too much fuel, and the pastry would burn before it blushed. Too little, and you'd serve half-raw lamb to the colonel. Victorian cooks learned to read the temperature by instinct, watching the color of flames, listening to the hiss of fat, and sometimes by placing a bare hand near the oven mouth for a fleeting second. It sounds dramatic, but you'd be surprised how accurate a practice palm could be. Cooks developed an almost choreographic rhythm: open the flue feed, the fire, adjust the damper, listen for the tick of the kettle. A good cook didn't just make meals, they conducted combustion. If the chimney draft changed because of a gust outside, everything could go awry. One baker's memoir recounts how an unexpected downpour ruined her sponge cake 3 times in one afternoon. Some scholars still debate which model of coal range most transformed the Victorian kitchen. Was it the Rumford stove with its fuel-saving design, or the closed-top model that promised consistency but delivered only smoky betrayal? Of course, technology promised progress, but not always clarity. Manufacturers claimed their stoves offered scientific heating, yet many cooks complained that no two were alike. One might simmer porridge gently, the next could turn it to crusted porridge brick within minutes. Manuals were rarely provided, and even when they were, they read like riddles. Keep the draft light but brisk. What does that mean when the wind howls through the coal chute like a banshee? Despite this, the kitchen ran like clockwork, albeit one powered by ash and resolve. You picture the cook, one eye on the bubbling pot, one hand adjusting the stove, damper her mind, ticking through 3 courses and an unexpected guest. A coal scuttle stands nearby, its curved lip blackened by constant use. Refilling it meant venturing to the coal cellar, often in the dark, navigating narrow steps, with hands full, and apron trailing. The coal itself was dusty sharp and gave off an oily scent when burned different from wood heavier somehow. And yet it was essential. Gas stoves were coming, yes, but they were newfangled suspect and often leaky. Coal was known. Coal was trusted, even if it bit back sometimes. And then came the soot. It settled everywhere on shelves and hair, on the undersides of teacups if you weren't careful. Recipes warned not of spicing errors, but of grit so common it was almost accepted. If your tart crust has gone gray, advised one kitchen guide a cloth over the oven door may help. Whether this helped flavor or merely morale remains up for debate. As you step closer to the stove, you feel its heat, not just the physical warmth, but a kind of pride radiating from the cast iron mass. This was the heartbeat of the kitchen, unpredictable but alive. To tame it was to earn respect. Many cooks had burn scars like medals and stories of soup disasters that were retold like war tales. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these stoves advanced culinary skill or simply introduced new hazards. But one thing is clear: no meal left that kitchen without a quiet pas de deux between coal flame and cook. A ladle clinks against a ceramic bowl, and you notice a smudge of something amber and sticky, perhaps a broth, or maybe the remnants of a sauce known only to the cook who made it. Nearby, an open book rests on the shelf, its pages warped by steam, and its script barely legible. But even if you could read it clearly, would it help Victorian recipes after all were written in a kind of culinary code? Flip through a cookbook from the 19th century, and you'll quickly realize it wasn't made for the novice. Measurements were loose poetic, even a knob of butter, a teacupful of milk, a walnut-sized lump of sweet. Time that was counted in lines of verse, in changes of light, or in instinct. Boil until it smells ready is one memorable phrase from an old Yorkshire recipe, which is oddly both charming and maddening. For a modern cook, these directions sound like nonsense, but to a trained Victorian kitchen worker, they were as exact as algebra. Part of this mystery was deliberate. Cookbooks often left key steps unstated because they were never meant to teach, they were meant to remind. These were aides memoire for those already trained in the culinary arts. For anyone else, they might as well have been spells written in riddles. And that wasn't just tradition, it was strategy. Researchers believe that cooks intentionally withheld information, especially in households where recipes meant power. If a rival kitchen maid couldn't make the blancmange as creamy or the ham as tender, well, that kept the head cook indispensable. Even more curious were the secret books, the handwritten collections kept hidden in apron pockets or biscuit tins. These weren't published. They were passed down, edited by grease-stained fingers, and lived in memories. A pinch of this. A warning scribbled in the margins. Too sharp if overboiled. Use salt only on Thursdays. Some scholars suggest these books served not just culinary purposes, but emotional ones too, a kind of diary with cinnamon stains and forgotten wisdom. Apprentices were expected to observe silently, never interrupting the cook mid-preparation. Asking too many questions could result in a scolding or worse, a kitchen demotion. You might spend weeks simply washing vegetables before you were trusted to trim a roast. Yet in that quiet time, knowledge seeped in. You learned how long to beat an egg by the sound it made, how to test jam with your fingertip instead of a thermometer. And when the moment came to replicate a dish, there was no looking at a recipe. You simply knew. Some accounts describe these recipes as oral maps passed down like folklore. That idea intrigues food historians, though not all agree. There is ongoing debate about how much of Victorian kitchen lore was truly hidden and how much was simply undocumented due to class assumptions. Published cookbooks were often written by middle-class women or professional male chefs, not the domestic staff who executed the meals. What survived was filtered through class and propriety, often missing the real brilliance behind the stove. Still, you can almost hear the voices of those forgotten cooks, murmuring proportions and tweaks under their breath, just out of reach. You wonder if some recipes were meant never to be shared, only felt, tasted, inherited. A bit of magic in the marrow. Near the open book, there's a dried herb bunch tied with fraying twine dangling from a shelf. It hangs like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one bothered to write down. A low gurgle rises from a pot near the stove. You lift the lid, and a wave of scent rolls out, meaty, rich, and oddly comforting. Inside is not a stew or a roast, but something more primal: bone broth, thick with collagen and memory. It simmers quietly, surrounded by jars of dripping and bits of gristle waiting for their next roll. Here, waste was a sin and transformation a virtue. Victorian kitchens ran on frugality, but not the kind that meant cutting corners. Rather, it was a sacred art of reinvention. Every scrap had a purpose, from marrow bones to fat skimmings. Dripping the rendered fat from roasts was collected in small earthenware pots. It formed the base of gravies, fried potatoes to a perfect crisp, and even flavored porridge in poorer households. A good pot of dripping was considered a treasure, mysteriously golden and dense. It sat near the hearth like a pet nobody named. Bone broth, meanwhile, was always on the go. Cooks would toss in bones, onion skin, carrot ends, even apple cores. It wasn't just for soup. It was a base for sauces, a balm for colds, and occasionally a quiet snack. Some kitchen staff were known to sip it from teacups when no one was looking. Was it for health or hunger? Historians remain divided. One theory claims that it was seen as a sort of universal tonic, something to warm the belly and steady the nerves. Others suggest it was simply the only thing hot and available after an 18-hour shift. Jelly, too, had its moment in the sun, or rather the larder. Boiled bones were cooled into aspic, shimmering with a strange elegance that belied their humble origins. And the suet crust, made from rendered beef fat, it formed the rich, flaky shell of many pies, both sweet and savory. Nothing was discarded if it could be baked boiled or blended into something edible. You notice a tray of leftovers being scraped into a shallow tin, bits of ham-browned onions, and yesterday's gravy. This would become a scrap pie, a common feature in many households. It wasn't just a matter of saving food, it was about stretching flavor across days, even disguising repetition with clever seasoning. Some cooks took pride in this improvisation, considering it a test of true skill. The ability to rework scraps into something that earned compliments from the dining room upstairs, that was artistry. But not all was savory. Sugar, when available, was used to preserve overripe fruit, turning bruised plums into jam and apple peel into jelly. This frugality was not born of trend, but of necessity, and it blurred the line between survival and cuisine. In the scullery, a girl might be boiling carrot tops for broth, while another dried bread crusts to grind into filler for sausage. Some researchers believe this ethos shaped the very rhythm of the kitchen. Meals weren't planned top down, but bottom up, starting with what needed using, not what was desired. Others argue this is an overly romantic view, pointing to the clear hierarchies and menu planning led by the lady of the house or butler. Still, the evidence simmers on jars of clarified fat lined up like soldiers a pot of broth that never quite goes empty, and the smell deep salty and somehow ancestral. And somewhere, a kitchen maid dips a ladle into the pot, glances quickly around, and sips. Not because she's hungry, but because she can. The clatter fades for a moment, and you notice someone new. A girl barely past childhood, her sleeves rolled high and hair tied back with a faded ribbon. She moves quickly, silently always, just out of the way. That's the kitchen maid. You won't find her name on the household rolls or mentioned in society diaries, but her hands have touched nearly every dish that left this room. Her story, like many others, is half seen, half lost. In the Victorian kitchen hierarchy, the kitchen maid ranked low, just above the scullery maid, and well below the cook. Her duties were endless, preparing vegetables, polishing utensils, cleaning spills, and fetching coal. She rose before dawn, long before the family upstairs stirred, and often finished her day past midnight. The kitchen was her world, and yet she wasn't really supposed to be seen. If she moved quickly and worked well, she remained invisible. If not, well, complaints rose faster than steam. Most kitchen maids were girls between 12 and 16 years old, many from rural families who sent them into service as a step toward better fortune, or at least a steady meal. Some were barely literate. Some had left school the year they learned to sign their names. Yet they entered this bustling world of boiling pots and simmering rules with remarkable resilience. They memorized dozens of expectations, from how to fold towels to how many seconds it took to clean a fish knife without streaks. Occasionally, if they proved especially capable, a kitchen maid might be promoted. Others vanished without explanation. Records from the time are conflicting. Some left to marry, some to nurse a sick parent, some because of a stern word from the cook that became the final straw. And some simply disappeared. Diaries and household logs show strange gaps. Lucy gone Eliza missing again with no follow-up. Scholars argue over the meaning. Was it common turnover, a sign of mistreatment, or just the fog of unrecorded domestic labor? Yet not all was grim. There are hints scattered in the margins of old notebooks and letters of quiet kindnesses. A head cook giving her kitchen maid an extra roll on cold mornings. A footman sneaking a boiled egg to the girl scrubbing pans. And perhaps most touching, a note written in the back of a recipe ledger for Mary should she ever run her own kitchen. Never forget the onion trick. This blend of discipline and tenderness defined life below stairs. Even the punishments, though harsh, followed their own peculiar rhythm. A broken plate might earn a silent week. A burned pudding could mean kitchen exile scrubbing walls for days. But sometimes, if the cook was in a good mood, or had burnt something herself, the kitchen maid would be forgiven with just a glance and a muttered, "Don't do it again." One account tells of a kitchen maid who learned to tell time by the smell of roasting beef. She couldn't read the clock, but she could say exactly when to baste the joint. "It's near the caramel part," she'd whisper. And she was always right. Historians still debate how much agency these girls truly had. Some argue They were powerless cogs in a vast domestic machine. Others point to letters and oral histories that show pride wit and unexpected moments of defiance. You watch the kitchen maid stir a pot and steal a glance at the back stairs as if dreaming of fresh air. For now, though, she returns to the cutting board, quiet, quick, and still, just out of sight. The water bubbles with a steady murmur, but there's no clock in sight, no ticking second hand, no kitchen timer. And yet the egg will be boiled perfectly. How you follow the cook's movements. One glance at the spoon, a hum of an old rhyme, and a pinch of salt tossed into the pot like a secret ingredient. Welcome to the world of egg timing without clocks, where intuition ruled and sand never ran out. Boiling an egg in the Victorian kitchen was not as simple as it might seem. Without reliable timepieces, cooks had to rely on cues passed down through generations. One of the more delightful tricks involves singing. A verse or two from a familiar folk song could measure out a soft-boiled egg with uncanny accuracy. By the time I finish Lavender's Blue, you'll have a runny yolk one kitchen maid once quipped in a letter home. Was it precise? Maybe not. But it often worked. Other methods were more tactile. One technique called for adding a spoonful of salt to the water, not for seasoning, but for science. Salt raises the boiling point slightly, and some claimed it helped the egg talk, making soft rattles as it cooked. A gentle hiss meant the water was too hot. A dull knock, just right. Researchers remain divided on whether these methods held real merit or were simply charming superstitions. Still, for those who used them daily, they were as good as gospel. There were even seasonal variations. In summer, with warmer kitchen air, cooks claimed the eggs cooked faster. In winter, the rule was to add a verse and a half more. A cook in Lancashire supposedly adjusted her timing to the chirping of a bird that nested outside her scullery window. If it sang twice before the egg floated, breakfast was served. This intuitive timing wasn't limited to eggs. Bread was left to rise until it looked proud. Fish was done when the smell changes, and custards were ready when they shivered slightly in the pan. Clocks existed, of course, but not always in the kitchen, and certainly not within reach of a flour-dusted hand juggling 3 pans and a screaming kettle. For many, these methods were passed along with affection, not instruction. An aunt might say, "Stir," until your arm says, "Stop." A grandmother might slap your wrist away from the pot and mutter, "Not yet, it hasn't sung." These phrases sound whimsical now, but in an age of inconsistent stoves and drafty ovens, they were often more accurate than watches. Still, these informal metrics created challenges. When a new maid joined the kitchen, she couldn't rely on the cook's rhymes unless she already knew them. One girl's 2 verses might be another's 3 and a chorus. It's no wonder that apprentice mistakes were common, or that scullery maids were sometimes demoted for timing sins, overboiled eggs, underdone puddings, or bread as hard as the coal it was baked beside. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these practices represented lost culinary genius or simply the lack of better tools. Some culinary historians see them as a testament to creativity under constraint. Others suggest they were born from necessity, not mastery. Yet as you watch the cook lift the egg from its bath and tap it gently on the wooden board, the shell cracking like parchment, you feel a quiet awe. It's perfect. No timer, no tech, just memory, patience, and a verse that ends right on cue. The door to the larder creaks open, and a peculiar wave of scent greets your nose. Onions, aged ham, a hint of sour cream, and something unnameable. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's definitely odd, Cold, brick-lined, and dimly lit, the Victorian larder was less a pantry and more a sensory riddle, and every house seemed to have one that smelled slightly different. Victorian larders were designed with careful, almost obsessive attention to airflow and insulation. Positioned on the north side of the house, always away from the sun, they were lined with stone or brick to keep things cool. Some had slate shelves, others marble. The idea was simple preserve food as long as possible without ice. Before refrigeration, these cool chambers were the beating heart of preservation, guarding buttermilk, cooked meats, and anything too valuable to risk spoiling. But the larder also became a repository of smells. Food here, aged, fermented, sometimes ripened beyond intention. On any given day, you might find a dish of clotted cream, a wrapped joint of beef, or a jar of pickled walnuts, and they all contributed to what servants called the larder's perfume. It was part function, part folklore. One diary from a housekeeper in Dorset reads, "The smell today is ripe with promise. Good cheese on the turn, and the duck fat from Sunday has done something odd, but not unfriendly." Brick walls, it turns out, were crucial. Some historians argue that they breathed absorbing moisture and odors in a way that plaster or wood could not. Others claim this is nonsense, a romantic notion invented by cooks nostalgic for their sootier youth. Either way, a brick-lined larder was the gold standard. Ice blocks were sometimes used too, though less often than people think. They were expensive, messy, and needed replacing regularly. Many households relied on shade and stone, and if the larder was cool enough, milk might keep for 2 whole days. Of course, the smells could turn sinister. Rotten eggs were the obvious culprit, but other culprits were trickier stale flour meat, gone just slightly sour pickles that fermented too far. And yet distinguishing spoilage from readiness became its own kind of expertise. A sharp nose might detect when ham had settled but not spoiled, or when a game bird was perfectly high, that is bordering on the outrageous, but still technically edible. Some historians find this appetite for high meat baffling, even revolting. Others suggest it reveals a sophisticated palate attuned to aging and depth of flavor. One surviving servant's guide even offered tips for larder vigilance: wipe down stone shelves with vinegar, rotate butter crocks weekly, and never trust cheese that sweats too early. Whether this was hygiene or ritual is still debated. But larders weren't just functional, they were full of superstitions. Some cooks kept lavender sprigs or mint sachets on the shelves, claiming they masked spoilage or calmed the cheese. There's no record of whether the cheese agreed, the strangest part. For all its importance, the larder was often an unloved place, too cold for comfort, too fragrant for conversation. It was visited quickly, left even faster. And yet everything that passed through the kitchen passed through the larder first. A quiet, cool gatekeeper. You step back out into the warmth of the main kitchen, and the door shuts with a gentle thud. Behind it, the odd perfume lingers: onions, ham, and something you still can't name. Not rot, not freshness, just potential. You're back near the hearth now, where the cook arranges a platter with quiet precision. A curl of gravy, just so. A crust of bread toasted to golden. But this isn't just dinner, it's a statement. In the Victorian household, food didn't merely feed the body. It whispered, shouted, or sometimes sobbed about social status. Tonight's goose isn't just poultry, it's a calling card. Every element of a Victorian meal held meaning. The thickness of soup, the flakiness of pastry, the alignment of forks, they all revealed something about the household. Guests didn't just eat, They read the table like a newspaper. Was the custard too loose? Clearly the cook lacked training, or worse, the lady of the house didn't care. Were the bread rolls uneven? A minor sin, perhaps, but one that might ripple through the drawing room in hushed critique. It's no wonder kitchen staff worked with military precision. A ruined sauce could be a social scandal. Menus, too, spoke volumes. The presence of turtle soup, for example, signaled upper-class ambition, or at least the desire to imitate it. Boiled beef might suggest thrift. Lamb with mint. Possibly a nod to tradition or regional pride. Some scholars suggest that menus evolved not just to reflect status, but to create it shaping reputations through culinary illusion. Others argue it was all reactive, that kitchens simply mirrored the trends of the aristocracy, no matter how impractical or extravagant. What's less debated is how much anxiety food could generate. One letter from a housemaid recalls a dinner party where the cook burst into tears after undercooking the game birds. The footman covered for her, she writes, said it was the French way. Everyone believed him, except the butler, who sniffed. In a world where dinner was theater, every role had to be played perfectly, even if the roast was faking an accent. And then there were the crumbs. Yes, crumbs. Victorian etiquette guides warned hostesses to watch for poor crumb management, an indicator of lower breeding. A guest who scattered crumbs across the tablecloth barbaric. A hostess who allowed it negligent. You'd think they were inspecting the results of a duel, not a bread roll. Gravy was another social signal. Thin, greasy gravy suggested poor stock or lazy reduction. A thick, glossy gravy, pure competence. It said that one cook was dismissed for excessive shine too much cornstarch in the juice. Whether this actually happened is debated, but the tale persists, like a culinary ghost story, passed from one maid to the next. The hierarchy even extended to where one sat and what one ate. Servants, as you'll see later, rarely tasted the food they prepared. But the lady of the house might judge a new guest's worthiness by how they handled a slice of game pie. Did they know to remove the jelly cap? Did they hesitate at the sight of pigeon? And yet, amid all this coded eating, there were moments of joy. A perfectly risen soufflé might earn the cook a compliment passed down through 3 layers of servants. A guest who asked for seconds could send ripples of pride through the kitchen. These moments, though, rare mattered. Some historians argue that food was the most powerful, unspoken language of the Victorian home. Others suggest it was just another battleground in the war of appearances. But either way, one thing's certain in this kitchen: a ladle was never just a ladle, it was a translator. You glance again at the platter, its elements quietly in balance. Not just a meal, a message perfectly plated. The kitchen feels strangely quiet today. No frantic chopping, no boiling over, just the soft rhythm of slicing cucumbers and the faint squeak of a cork being eased from a jar. On the wooden table, vinegar fumes swirl in the air. Welcome to pickling day, a curious ritual in the Victorian household that blurred the lines between chemistry superstition and sheer boredom. Pickling was not just a means of preserving food, it was a household event. Whole afternoons were devoted to sterilizing jars, boiling brine, and laying out rows of vegetables like troops awaiting inspection. Cabbage, onions, beetroot, eggs, even lettuce on occasion, were brined or vinegared into submission. It seems odd now, but Victorian households sometimes pickled out of habit more than need. Better a shelf of jars than a cellar of regrets, quipped one Yorkshire housekeeper, suggesting that spoilage was not merely inconvenient, it was a moral failing. Certain rules were ironclad. You pickled on dry days, only moisture in the air. It was said, ruined the brine. Iron pots were avoided unless you liked your onions to taste like pennies. Silver spoons were preferred, but only if you could be sure they'd survive the vinegar. And absolutely no arguing during the process. One superstition held that quarrels turned the pickles sour, a phrase that appeared often in both recipe books and marriage advice columns. Recipes varied, but not by much salt, sugar, spice, and an unwavering trust in malt vinegar. Some were hot, some cold. Some included mustard seeds or cloves. One handwritten recipe stuck between pages of a Victorian housekeeping guide simply reads, "Pickle everything. Even if they won't eat it, they'll respect it." Some historians interpret this as a reflection of Victorian thrift. Others believe it hints at the need for control in a world full of change, a way to capture and stabilize something, if only for winter. The strangest part might be what was chosen for pickling. Eggs made sense, as did onions, but lettuce. That's where it gets puzzling. Several records confirm that Victorian cooks did in fact pickle lettuce, especially in the cooler counties. The result was soggy bitter and oddly squeaky to chew. Why do it? Theories abound. One camp believes it was an attempt to mimic continental trends. Another suggests it was just a symptom of seasonal boredom. When nothing fresh remained, you preserved whatever was left. These rituals also held a kind of meditative charm. One cook described the act of slicing beetroot for pickling as an hour's rest for the mind, if not the hands. The repetition, the vinegar sting the colorful layers settling in their jars, it was strangely soothing. In a life defined by chaos and commands, pickling offered a moment of stillness, however pungent. Not everyone enjoyed the results. Servants were often excluded from the final tasting, and one memoir notes a housemaid who gagged at the smell of pickled cauliflower only to be scolded for weak sensibilities. Yet the jars lined up like trophies in the pantry, proof of diligence, devotion, and perhaps a touch of obsession. Scholars remain divided on whether pickling in Victorian homes was driven by necessity or tradition. Some argue it was pragmatic genius, others see it as culinary overkill. But one thing is clear: when the last plum had been sugared and the final onion brined, the larder took on a new identity, no longer just a storage room, but a library of edible time capsules. You look at the kitchen table now. A row of glass jars catches the light. Red gold and green slices float like preserved memories. Still, and waiting. A soft clink of cutlery signals the end of another meal upstairs. Down here, though, it's far from over. The plates return scraped clean or suspiciously untouched, and the serving platters come back half full. You might think the kitchen maids get to dig in next, but in the Victorian kitchen, what was prepared and what was eaten were rarely the same thing. Welcome to the mystery of the invisible menus. Servants rarely tasted the dishes they spent hours preparing. Instead, they dined on separate fare, usually simpler, cheaper, and far less seasoned. The roast duck, the soufflé, the syllabub, those belonged to the family and their guests. The help might get the offcuts, the duck neck, a spoonful of sauce, or if they were lucky, the remains of a trifle left too long in the sun. The rules were strict, though rarely written down. Kitchen staff were expected to remain detached from the meals they created. One memoir recalls a cook who was dismissed not for burning the pudding, but for licking a spoon before the dish had left the kitchen. The mistress said it was the same as theft, she wrote, though the spoon was scarcely wet. Whether this was about hygiene or hierarchy remains a matter of debate among scholars. But the message was clear. Servants were not to sample the symbols of wealth. Instead, most kitchen staff ate in shifts, often long after the family's meal had ended. These servant meals were basic stews, porridge, stale bread, the occasional scrap pie. In grander houses, there might be a roast from earlier in the week, cold and dry. Some staff brought their own food, especially if they had dietary needs or didn't trust the communal pot. One account from a kitchen maid in Manchester describes stashing an apple in her apron every day just in case the stew had bones, but no meat. There are conflicting accounts about how strictly these rules were enforced. In some homes, the cook was allowed a small portion of whatever dish was made if only to taste for seasoning. In others, even that was frowned upon. A few progressive households encouraged servant meals to mirror upstairs dining more closely, but those were the exception. One historian describes these divides as culinary segregation, a term debated, but undeniably vivid. And yet, despite the separation, knowledge still flowed. Kitchen staff learned to identify flavors, textures, and timing even without tasting. They could tell if a sauce had split by smell or if a tart had overbaked by touch. The irony was rich. Those who knew the food best rarely enjoyed it. But every so often, a plate would return with something untouched, a guest too full a dish too bold. And if the cook nodded discreetly, the staff might get a spoonful of the rarest treat. These moments were whispered about, even counted. I've had syllabub twice this year. One footman once boasted, to which the scullery maid replied, "Must be your luck, or your waistcoat." Some researchers believe this ritual distancing servants preparing what they could never consume deepened the divide between classes more than any parlor rule or silver spoon. Others argue it built resilience, a kind of quiet pride in feeding others, even when one went hungry. You look again at the stack of returned plates. They gleam scraped bare and rinsed. A small bowl of wilted salad sits untouched in the corner. The kitchen maid eyes it, then looks away. Perhaps later, if no one notices. The air turns starchy, thick with the scent of flour and damp linen. Somewhere near the scullery, a cloth is being wrung tight, and in the back corner, a shirt collar stiffens as if bracing for inspection. Welcome to the starch battle. A silent war waged not just with aprons and bonnets, but with the invisible expectations pinned to every fold and crease. Flour in the Victorian kitchen wasn't reserved for pastry and pudding. It was a weapon of appearance used to stiffen garments with the same care as one would glaze a pie. Starch was made by boiling flour and water until it reached a gloopy paste, then straining it through cloth to remove lumps. This thickened liquid was dabbed or soaked into linens which were then ironed within an inch of their lives. Ruffles stood up like architecture. Apron edges could slice air, and it mattered. A crisply starched cap said as much about a kitchen maid's discipline as her speed with a paring knife. Some households even had starching days scheduled like Sunday roasts. Aprons, collars, kerchiefs, all bathed in floury water, and then hung out to dry, flapping like ghost flags. Once stiffened, these garments were ironed using heavy soot-black implements heated over the range. No electric plugs, no safety handles, just skill timing and the quiet fear of scorch marks. Why go to such trouble in the middle of a chaotic, grimy kitchen? Historians remain divided. Some suggest it was about pride. A uniform could be the only dignity afforded to someone who cleaned fish guts for 12 hours a day. Others argue that the starch was a sign of obedience, a visible cue that the servant was following the unspoken rules. Still, others think it was vanity plain and simple. If the sleeves are crisp, the eyes won't see the hands, noted one housekeeper, implying that flour could distract from fatigue. There were even rules within the rules. Cooks were allowed softer aprons, practicality over polish. But kitchen maids and scullery girls, they were expected to present stiff collars and tucked hems, especially when entering the dining room or serving food. It was a strange contradiction. A girl could smell of fish, her arms red from scrubbing, but as long as her apron curled like parchment, she was respectable. The flour used for starch was usually the cheapest available, sometimes so coarse that it left faint streaks or attracted moths, and yet replacing it with better flour was rarely permitted. Good flour was for cakes. Bad flour was for shirts. That was the rule. A few inventive maids swapped in rice water or cornstarch when they could, claiming it produced a better finish. But if discovered, they risked more than disapproval. They risked upsetting the sacred rhythm of the household. Even stranger were the starched rag pieces, small, neatly pressed scraps of cloth used by lower servants in place of full uniforms. These weren't worn for show, but functioned as badges. They proved the maid had done her own laundry, followed the rules, and ironed it without burning holes. Some wore these pieces pinned to their sleeves or tucked into belts like subtle armor. There is no scholarly consensus on whether the starch rituals served to empower or oppress. Some argue that within the folds of every stiffened hem was a hidden defiance, a refusal to disappear entirely. Others suggest it was merely a symptom of a society obsessed with surfaces. You glance at the drying line above the hearth. A kitchen maid stretches to unpin her apron, careful not to wrinkle it. The fabric crackles slightly, like paper about to be read. Something catches your eye on the windowsill. A strange little ceramic figure, pale and hollow, shaped like a tiny bird. Its beak points upward, mouth agape, as if mid-song. It's nestled beside a half-rolled pie crust, quietly waiting for its turn. This is the secret of the pie bird, one of the oddest and most endearing tools in the Victorian kitchen arsenal. To the untrained eye, it might seem decorative, perhaps even whimsical. But the pie bird served a very practical and occasionally superstitious function. Its job was to vent steam from within the pie, allowing hot air to escape without cracking the crust or flooding the filling. When placed at the center of a bubbling meat or fruit pie, the bird's open beak provided an escape route, preventing soggy bottoms and erupting pastry. The design was clever. As the filling heated steam rose to the center and funneled out through the pie bird, which whistled faintly if the pressure got too high. Cooks would sometimes judge readiness by that sound. Just a gentle wheeze meant everything inside was hot and harmonious. No hiss, probably underdone. A high-pitched squeal. Your apples were boiling into oblivion. Pie vents existed long before birds, of course. Medieval cooks used hollow reeds or folded leaves, and some even shaped their own vents from dough. But the bird design caught on in the 19th century, perhaps due to its visual charm, or perhaps because it echoed the old nursery rhyme, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. Some scholars believe this link helped popularize the pie bird in middle-class kitchens. Others argue it was pure marketing, nothing more. As always, there's no clear consensus, just a trail of soot and ceramic. Beyond function, pie birds had flair. Some were shaped like owls or cats, and the truly fanciful ones were painted in blues and greens to match fine china sets. But most were plain white, easy to clean, and easy to hide if the cook was superstitious. And yes, Superstition did play a role. Some cooks believed the pie bird sang out bad luck, releasing not just steam, but negative energy trapped inside the dish. One Welsh cook reportedly refused to bake without hers, claiming it had saved 3 Christmases and 1 wedding. Others took a more practical view. The bird's reduced mess helped avoid cracking and made pies more presentable for the finicky eyes upstairs. They became so essential that some cooks carried their own from post to post, wrapped in linen and tucked into their personal knife roll. "It's not the pie, I trust, it's the bird," wrote one Victorian pastry chef, half joking. Pie birds weren't just for sweet dishes either. Savory pies, mince kidney chicken, used them just as often, sometimes with little felt pads stuffed into the beak to help catch drips. Over time, they became shorthand for professionalism. If a pie arrived without a vent and the crust sagged, judgment was swift. One housemaid wrote in her diary, "No bird, no crust. No crust, no praise." Some modern historians find this obsession with venting curious. Did it really make such a difference? Or was it another layer in the Victorian kitchen's strange choreography of tools, rituals, and rules? Regardless, few objects so perfectly captured the blend of function, folklore, and flair. You look again at the pie bird. It sits still, watching the oven like a sentinel. The crust around it rises slowly, steadily unbroken. No hiss, no squeal. Just quiet confidence shaped like a sparrow. The scent shifts again, less of flour and fat, more of toasted crust and rising yeast. You glance toward the oven, where a loaf bakes in silence. But the cook doesn't rely on smell alone. She leans in, listens, then knocks gently on the bread side with her knuckles. A hollow sound. She nods, satisfied. Welcome to the realm of the oven whisperers, those who could read baked goods like tea leaves. Victorian ovens didn't come with thermostats, no handy lights or timers. Just coal fire draft and a cook's intuition. Managing these unpredictable heat boxes was a skill honed through years of trial, error, and patience. You learned to hear the oven, to detect the hum of a pie, bubbling too hard, the faint sizzle of fat dripping on the hearth plate, the silence that meant something had gone terribly wrong. Cooks developed a language of observation. A pale crust, the oven's too cool, a cracked top too hot at the start, burnt edges and raw center. You've likely overstuffed the tray. But beyond visual cues, there was the art of sound. Knocking on bread loaves, sometimes called rapping, was a time-honored test. A dull thud meant underbaked. A hollow thump meant done. And occasionally a faint squeak meant too soon, but almost. This language wasn't taught in books. It was passed down in gestures, mutters, and raised eyebrows. Apprentices learned to watch the cook's face as much as the dough. Some swore the oven had moods, temperamental after rain, untrustworthy during thunderstorms, spiteful on Mondays. Whether superstition or pattern recognition, it helped cooks anticipate disaster before it bubbled over. Flour on the forearm was common not just for handling dough, but for testing heat. Some placed a scrap of paper or a strand of hair inside to measure how quickly it scorched. One handwritten guide advised open the door with care and let your nose judge the honesty of the crust. Another simply said, "It's ready when it smells like toast, but richer." Not everyone trusted these instincts. Some upper-class households insisted on temperature gauges, bulky brass devices placed inside ovens. But they were expensive, prone to cracking, and often gave misleading readings. In the end, most cooks preferred their own senses. They'd tap the loaf, sniff the air, watch the curl of steam. That was the true science. There is ongoing debate among culinary historians about whether Victorian cooking instincts were more reliable than today's measuring methods. Some claim these women developed a sixth sense for their stoves, a kind of heat empathy. Others suggest the results were inconsistent at best, especially when passed from one range model to another. Yet no one denies the skill it took to make consistent bread without consistent conditions. Oven whisperers didn't just bake, they interpreted. They saw how pastry edges lifted when happy, how a biscuit cracked when rushed. One retired cook recalled that her mother could predict a storm just by watching her dough refuse to rise. She said it felt the thunder coming. The woman chuckled. And she wasn't wrong most days. Still, for all the mystique it came down to, hours spent beside the heat. Loaves turned pies, rotated trays shifted in and out like actors on a stage. And at the center of it all, a cook who listened more than she spoke. You watch the loaf emerge, now golden and crisp. The cook taps it once more, hears that low, hollow ring, and smiles slightly. No words, just confirmation. The bell rings, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. The calm shatters like a dropped teacup. Instantly, the kitchen stirs to life. A sauce is whisked harder, a roast is tested, a maid rushes past with a tray of still warm tarts. That sound means one thing: dinner is about to be served. And for the staff below stairs, it often triggered something close to panic. The dinner bell wasn't just a signal, it was a countdown. Everything had to be perfect by the time the first footstep echoed in the hallway upstairs. If the soup wasn't hot enough, if the fish wasn't plated with parsley, if the wine sauce had split, there would be questions, and those questions rarely had kind answers. That's why Victorian kitchens often operated under what one cook called flurried order. It looked chaotic, but every move was rehearsed. Everyone knew their cue. What outsiders rarely understood was just how theatrical dinner service could be. Dishes had to be plated at the last possible second to preserve temperature and texture, yet they also needed to be passed quickly and in the correct order: soup, then fish, then fowl, then roast. The wrong dish sent up the stairs could insult a guest, confuse the butler, or spoil the rhythm of conversation. Imagine serving game pie before the consommé. For some households, that was practically a declaration of war. Behind this precision lay intense pressure. The cook carried the heaviest burden, responsible not only for flavor, but for the entire flow of the evening. One misstep, and the mistress of the house might feign illness just to avoid embarrassment. A failed pudding could be excused, once, twice might result in dismissal. It's no surprise that some kitchens reported incidents of fainting scalding, or even kitchen tears moments before service. Yet above stairs no one ever knew. That was the point. Journals from the period describe this moment as the storm before the hush. Plates clattered, voices clipped into urgent fragments. Someone always dropped a spoon. And then silence. The doors opened, the dishes disappeared, and the kitchen exhaled. Some historians argue that this high-stakes ritual turned cooks into performance artists, composers of heat, aroma, and structure. Others suggest it was emotional labor, magnified and masked. One kitchen maid wrote, "We were actresses with red hands and flour in our hair. No curtain call, just a bell." Interestingly, some households staged their dinners not just for flavor, but for appearances. There are accounts of elaborate roasts that were never meant to be eaten golden and glistening, carved with flair, then removed and replaced with more practical cuts in the kitchen. A form of edible illusion designed to impress. Some guests may have suspected, others preferred not to ask. But beneath the spectacle was always the question, what if something went wrong? What if the sauce curdled? That particular disaster haunted Victorian kitchens. Cream sauces were delicate, prone to splitting under heat or poor stirring. The phrase "the sauce turned" became a euphemism for catastrophe. One poor cook wrote of hiding in the coal cellar after such an event, ashamed to be seen. "I burned my pride more than the pan," she confessed. Yet there were victories too. A flawless dessert. A roast so tender it drew compliments through 3 layers of staff. Sometimes a wink from the butler signaled success. Sometimes a warm roll returned. Uneaten meant the guest was full, not dissatisfied. You listen now as the bell's echo fades and the final plate departs. The kitchen holds its breath. Then slowly the clatter resumes, quieter, relieved. The worst has passed, at least until breakfast. The plates are gone, the pots scrubbed. But the day isn't done, not yet. In the corner, a wooden bucket groans as it's filled again, this time with steaming rinse water. A pair of reddened hands dips a stack of plates one by one into the swirling gray. The final ritual of the Victorian kitchen begins in silence. Welcome to the quiet, aching world of washing up. After the spectacle of dinner, the glamour dissolved down here. It was all lather and labor. Washing up was not simply about cleanliness. It was a test of endurance, of patience, and sometimes of dignity. Water had to be heated by kettle or stove, poured with care to avoid cracks in the china. Soap was homemade or purchased in thick blocks, often gritty, smelling of lye or carbolic. Cloths wore through quickly. Brushes were hand-cut, and nothing, not a single butter knife or pudding mold, could be left undone. Washing dishes was typically the domain of the scullery maid, the lowest-ranking figure in the kitchen staff. Often, younger than 16, she worked longer hours than anyone else and touched nearly every item in the kitchen, but rarely any food on the plate. It was her job to scrape, scrub, rinse, and dry until every item sparkled again. Silver had to shine. Crystal couldn't cloud, and enamel pots, chipped or not, were to be stacked with precision. The job wasn't just thankless, it could be dangerous. Scalding water, cracked glass, sharp knives buried in murky suds. One slip could mean a deep cut, or worse. Gloves were unheard of. Burns were expected. The scullery was where hands went to disappear, wrote one maid in a letter, half joking. Half. And then there was the cold. Unless the kitchen fire was still roaring, the air grew chill fast. Wet hands turned numb. Aprons stiffened with starch and water. Some girls wrapped their feet in rags, soaked in vinegar, a bizarre trick believed to fend off frostbite. Did it work? Historians disagree, but the practice shows how far they were willing to go just to keep standing. But the hardest part wasn't the heat or cold, it was the silence. After dinner, the rest of the household went still. Guests retired. The lady played piano. The master read by firelight. Meanwhile, the kitchen was filled with the slosh of water, the drip of drying ladles, the squeak of a cloth wrung dry. No praise, no acknowledgement, just the sounds of labor humming into the night. Some scholars argue that this silence became a kind of meditation, that the repetitive nature of dishwashing offered maids a rare moment to think, to breathe, to imagine something beyond the basement walls. Others see it as a daily humiliation, a necessary ritual designed to reinforce class lines. Scrub the master's spoon. Wipe the guest's gravy plate. Repeat. Still, there are hints of resilience. One account mentions 2 scullery maids who sang softly as they worked, harmonizing over a tub of greasy pans. Another told of a girl who etched poetry into the soap blocks, one line at a time. And then there's the diary entry that simply reads, "The silver glinted tonight." I suppose that's something. You watch now as the last pot is dried and stacked. The bucket is emptied. A cloth is wrung and hung by the hearth. The scullery maid rubs her hands red and raw and blows gently into her fingers. No one applauds, but the dishes are clean. The kitchen once more is still. And so, the embers dim in the coal range, and the last echoes of footsteps fade into the hush of midnight stone. The basement kitchen, once a furnace of clatter and command, rests in silence, now its secrets cooled beneath folded aprons and stacked plates. What was once heat and motion is now memory, steeped in the scent of dripping fat, dried lavender, and flour in the air like ghost dust. You've wandered through the clinks and whispers of a world few ever saw. You've listened to the quiet knock on a bread loaf, watched a pie bird guard its golden crown, and stood beside a kitchen maid who knew the timing of an egg better than any clock. In those rooms, under those ceilings, history wasn't written. It was stewed, salted, and sometimes burned. Let the larder door close gently behind you. Let the warmth of broth and soft starch lull your thoughts. Somewhere, a stove still simmers, a scullery song drifts out a window, and a hand red from washing turns off the lamp. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?